Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching the Fineprint. In the first 10 months of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code being in force, over 1,000 individuals have been registered as resolution professionals. Once appointed, these resolution professionals take over the control of the company with the objective of protecting its assets and business operations. But in doing so, resolution professionals are facing issues on three fronts. First, friction with management or promoters of the company. Second, challenges related to creditors. And third, painful processes. The Fineprint spoke with three resolution professionals to better understand the situation on ground. From infrastructure to aviation to poultry farms, Anil Kohli of ARC Resolution Professionals has been appointed as an interim resolution professional at More Farms and Kalptaru Alloys, and as resolution professional at Tirupati Infra Projects, SR Foils, Maxtech Oil and Summit Aviation. Kohli pointed out that just getting the requisite information from erstwhile managements can become a Herculean task.
In each and every, all of the 6 cases, even in 2 cases I was replaced, that IRP was replaced by me as a resolution professional. IRP had not got any information from the corporate debtor. He could not even take the custody, no, could not take the management. Then I came in, I contacted the corporate debtor, explained the things, was able to handle him and nicely showed him various orders under section 19, and told him that if he does not agree to or comply by these orders, he is going to face contempt of the court. And because once an order is produced before you on the similar lines, if you require me to take another order for him, that is actually contempt of the court, and you are not seeing the precedence of the court that yes, a court has said that corporate debtors and all other persons concerned have to comply to the directions of the insolvency professional.
Vikram Bajaj of Renaissance Capital Advisors echoed a similar view. Bajaj is the resolution professional at Chaparia Industries, the second company to have its debt recast plan approved by the NCLT. Bajaj is also engaged at Swadisht Oils and BJN Hotels. For him, convincing promoters that they are no longer in control has been the toughest part.
For the first time in India, there is a regime where the control is actually moving from their hands. So far, they have always been in the driving seat, and that's a paradigm shift. So there is a resistance. They would put across that they have already appealed the proceedings. So till the matter is sub judice, till the appeals are decided, they will not let you do anything, because otherwise their appeal will become infructuous. Then there would be resistance as to sharing the information or the quantum and veracity of it. In all this scenario, there is a challenge that you are already receiving claims, and you have resistance as to sharing the information as to books of accounts and all. Then how you verify those claims?
The unwelcoming behavior towards resolution professionals doesn't just stop with the management. It's trickling down to employees too. That's been the experience of Sanjeev Ahuja, tasked with the revival of MBL infrastructure.
There's a difference between hostility, where people, IPs have not been allowed to enter the premises, and there's been absolutely non-cooperation in terms of no information to be given, and you create a kind of a suffocating atmosphere for a stranger. But on the other hand, what happens is the loyalties do continue with the promoters, with the erstwhile management, for the simple reason that there are two aspects to it. One, employees have been working with them for long, right? They are the employers, and they are used to speaking to each other, looking at each other. They are not too much aware, or they're not aware of what exactly this law means. On one side, somebody tells them that the powers of the board are suspended, and here is a guy who's a stranger who will probably call the shots going forward. So it's a bit of dilemma as to he was the guy and today he's not the guy, but then they also hear in the same breath that it's a matter of 6 months, and once everything is back to normal, he's the guy who's going to be back in power. So they can't displease him, they can't kind of, do anything against me.
The troubles of resolution professionals don't just end with erstwhile promoters, management and employees. Dealing with operational and financial creditors is proving to be a challenge too. Once an insolvency application is accepted by the NCLT, an interim resolution professional takes over. Among other things expected of an interim professional in the first 30 days, one is calling for claims from operational and financial creditors and verifying them.
There is a funding wherein the funding has happened for acquisition of certain specific machineries. Now the entire loan documentation does not speak of what those specific machineries are supposed to be. And then there are other lenders who have charged on the machineries as a block of plant and machinery. So specific charges will always prevail over the non-specific charges, but then you do not have a description of what those machineries are. How do you identify those machineries from the specifically charged machineries? And then there is a case where the financial creditor is claiming that they have a second charge, but then the first charge holders have never ceded that charge. There is no communication from the first charge holders to that effect. But the corporate debtor has created the charge and the financial creditor is claiming the charge.
If I am able to kind of source a fund, a source of fund which can come from say a sale of an asset which is not required, or certain some transaction which can help me generate some fund which will be used for operations, because that's the whole essence of a going concern. The queries were raised as to why can't this money be used to kind of reduce the exposure, right, of the banks. Now that is very difficult to kind of explain at times, that for 6 months or 9 months, whatever the case may be, one has to see that for all this while you've been dealing with the company, everything was fine, the account was standard, you were getting your interest payments in time, everything was fine. Now is the time when you have to give them the oxygen which is badly required. And the whole idea of meeting and creditors in control, the concept is you guys would be in control, but you have to still ensure that the oxygen supply continues, right? So that the small a big difference actually from debtors in possession in BIFR earlier to creditors in control at times has been stretched a bit too far, where in spite of a specific section which says that these actions cannot be taken without the approval of COC, but somehow COC members, and some of them, they expect each and everything should be brought to their notice, each and everything should have their permission, which practically is not possible.
Resolution professionals also told me that most creditors are picking IRPs based on the fees they charge and turning a blind eye to lack of experience and resources they come with. Others are sending those representatives to Committee of Creditors who are not even authorized to take decisions, which in turn stretches the timelines prescribed under the Insolvency Code. Besides friction with management and creditors, on the process front, the challenges are twofold: squeezed time frame and lack of understanding of the Insolvency Code.
It's not very easy to complete entire things within the period as required. Under 30 days you have to prepare that information memorandum and take custody, take management. You need at least 10-15 days to to take control of the person himself, the person behind the corporate debtor company, the promoter or whosoever. So these things, then there's something like valuation, taking the you have to study the assets before appointing a valuer, because the person who will be fit to do the valuation, like for in one of my matter there are helicopters. So now helicopters, you need to have a specialized valuer, so you have to trace the valuer and then only appoint, while you are given only 7 days to complete that process. So some of the timelines are very stringent.
In my very first case, I got a mandate from the Committee of Creditors to open a new bank account for running the process. And since there were no bankers on board, I could not simply have a bank account opened with one of the lending banks. In the entire process, I approached couple of banks, but everybody turned me down for requisition of a proper board resolution. They wanted signatures of directors on the account opening forms. They would not accept a resolution of committee of creditors for opening the bank account. And even if they did process after a lot of convincing, it was turned down by a reply stating that the company is having exposure with the banks which has gone bad. It is already a NPA accounts. Resolution is not as per the standard format. Signatures of directors are not matching. And in the entire 180 days, I could not get a bank account open, even though the resolution was approved by NCLT in the course of 180 days.
The last issue may seem like a small one, but speaks volumes about the much required change in approach towards this new law. Now coming to the other big story of this week. It's a proposal that will set the governance cat among promoter pigeons across India Inc. A corporate governance committee appointed by securities regulator SEBI has recommended that at least half of the members on a listed company's board must be independent. Menaka Doshi spoke to Cyril Shroff, managing partner at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas and a member of the SEBI committee, to better understand the impact of this recommendation on promoters of companies.
I'm surprised that there was the need felt to do this at this stage, because just about 2 or 3 years ago we went through a fairly large corporate governance rehaul when the Companies Act 2013 was enacted, as a result of which there were several changes made in SEBI's listing obligations, clause 49, etc., etc. So it's just about 2 years ago that we went through a sea change, for instance, in the way related party transactions are approved and reported and disclosed. What would have prompted us in 2 years to relook at it so extensively? It's a 177-page report.
So, sort of 2 points about that. I think the Companies Act is more general because it applies both to listed and unlisted companies. And SEBI, as the market regulator, needed both more jurisdiction as well as more sharper tools for governing the listed company. There's over 5,000 listed companies, which is where really a lot of the business takes place. So I think there's a nuanced difference between the Companies Act and what SEBI does, and they work together. So I think that is one. I think the second piece was, again, this is again an evolutionary thing. So there's no finishing line to a corporate governance conversation, or thinking about it in terms of every 10 years we should do something. I think the environment in the country required a relook at it because of several conflicts and the roles of various organs of corporate governance not being very sharply defined. So I think there was a need, and as we went into the details of each of the elements of it, we realized that there were a lot of loopholes that required to be plugged.
So to come back to the main recommendation, or at least the most eye-catching one, that half the board should be independent. I could counter-argue, Mr. Shroff, and I could use your words in some of the debates that we've done, where you've questioned the taking away of control from promoters, by adding more and more governance requirements in companies, insisting on more independent directors on board. Why would I take the risk to start a company, to build it up, to list it, if despite majority shareholding, I have no control over the board, that half the board is independent?
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have control. I think the independents on the board are there for sort of giving balance to the sort of interests of all the stakeholders.
50% of the board may or may not vote in my favor or in the favor of the resolution I'm moving.
I think that's why I think the conversation has moved forward in terms of a broader, even how company law has changed, where there's a responsibility to a broader set of stakeholders and not just the shareholders. So I see your point in terms of whether this dilutes the control debate, but for well-governed companies which balance the interests of all stakeholders, there is a right balance, and there shouldn't be such a conflict in terms of objectives.
But we live in a real world where often promoters want to do with companies, and when I say promoters, I mean majority shareholders. Let me dispense with the word promoter, because it's sort of very old-fashioned sounding. Majority shareholders, those who have control, are being deprived of it, even though they have it through voting rights and shares, are being deprived of it in the boardroom because half the board will be independent and it may or may not agree with the controlling shareholders' decisions. So in effect, why would I bother to ever build a controlling stake in a company?
See, it's always a reaction to something that happens in the real world. And if the general perception is that if the investing public and the market has lost faith in that model to some extent, that promoters having that kind of control misuse or abuse their power, and there'll always be exceptions, then that needs to be fixed. And this was one of the key tools that was used.
In your experience, does this exist anywhere in the world, or will India become the first country in the world to mandate?
I think there's a lot happening in terms of the nature of the balance between equity and debt, bankruptcy code and all of that. I think there's also a lot happening in terms of the new genre of companies that are coming to market. They are not coming to market with the traditional model where promoters hold 51% and 75%. A lot of the new age businesses come with very small promoter holding, large institutional holding. So that's 10 years from now, you will probably find much less of the old world type of companies and much more of particularly in technology, or there is this migration which is taking place from the old economy to the new economy, and the ownership model is very different.
Okay. The third more noteworthy one comes in the chapter when you talk about promoters. And there is the detailed laying out of the sharing of information by those who are considered to be continuous insiders or continuously in possession of insider information. It was a little technical, I'll admit, and I was reading it really fast. I couldn't quite get the gist of it. Could you explain to us what you all were hoping to achieve there?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of top few recommendations of the report. So let's see what happens today in corporate India. And again, it's not just about promoters, it could include multinationals and several other kind of formats. So information sharing today happens sort of in the shadows. It happens in informal channels. There is a regulatory white space over here. So the traditional method of justifying it under the existing insider trading regulations is that it happens for a legitimate purpose, and that the controlling promoter or controlling shareholder has a legitimate purpose to receive this information. But it's all grey. And in fact, what happens is that very often the controlling shareholders have access to special information on the verge of important transactions or price-sensitive events. There are good companies and there are bad companies, but what happens in the latter variety very often is that this information leaks and then is the basis of a lot of market manipulation, and it is rampant. What this does is that it reinforces the line around the fact that price-sensitive information which occurs in the boundaries of the company with insiders should not travel outside the boundaries of the company. But if it has to do so because controlling shareholders and promoters require access to that information, this creates a green channel. What this does is that it requires people who are in that position to enter into a formal agreement with the company. They need to meet the eligibility criteria for this. Either they're promoters or promoters of promoters, or if they're 25% and more, so like a private equity house. And if they require access to continuous information to guide the strategy of the company, then instead of saying, no, you can't get it, this actually helps them because it creates a green channel which gives them peace of mind that there is now at least a formal, it's like legalizing prohibition in terms of, and it's a very similar analogy. Rather than banning something altogether and having it done in the shadows, this creates a legal channel for access to information with safeguards. Obviously, it doesn't do away with the rest of the insider trading code. So trading on the basis of this information will still be dealt with this, and there's a separate SEBI
committee. But just sharing the information, if done within this framework, as you've pointed out, will no longer be,
because then it's sort of exempted from.
Then it's not a violation of
it's not. So let's take examples of multinationals who have listed subsidiaries in India. They have constant access of information. There is an information asymmetry. The normal public does not have it. And today it just happens just on the basis of informal reporting. What they will now need to do with this is to sign agreements under this green channel And the words that I used are the information goes from one safe container to another safe container with a paper trail.
And these agreements will be signed by, like you said, multinationals with parent companies, or can it
whoever
also be
access to information, even a promoter's promoter as well.
So can it be, for instance, in the Infosys case, many people were raising the question on how Mr. Murthy seemed to have information that general shareholders did not have or public shareholders did not have. Would those kinds of relationships also need to be covered in this
I don't want to
framework?
comment on that case, but
as an illustration.
Yeah, but even then I want to stay away from that. But still, someone like that would not get access to information. Because
I could give you a Tata Mistry example, but I suspect you might not want to comment on that as well.
I don't want to comment on either, because, but you need to be in a controlling position. So if you're in control, then you have a legitimate reason. That's why it creates this. Or you could be someone like a PE house who has a nominee on the board.
Okay, that's a better illustration, less controversial. Okay, fine. Fair enough. Okay,
but it addresses the basic issue of information asymmetry in the markets.
All right, fair enough. I must confess, I would like to study it a little bit more, and I'm sure I'll have many more questions right after that. But the next thing I wanted to move to was related party transactions, where you all have suggested that though the SEBI requirements go one step beyond the Companies Act and say no related party can vote on a related party transaction, you have said make an exception there and allow for a related party to cast a negative vote.
Yeah.
What was the purpose of that?
So sometimes related parties, let's say it includes families which have different factions, and sometimes people within that group have different views.
Okay.
So you could have either because of their internal differences or whatever may be the reason, and that block sometimes is used in order to achieve a certain outcome. But if other than the sort of uninterested, sort of non-related party shareholders, if there's somebody in that group who also believes that there is an abuse that is taking place, they can vote against but not in favor.
Okay, got it.
So it gives more firepower.
I can think of one more illustration. I know you will duck comment, but I think wasn't the recent Raymond case about two factions of the family? Okay, no comment. More interestingly, what you have plugged through these recommendations is the fairly ugly practice of these sudden brand agreements that come about, where a promoter or a promoter-related entity turns out to be the owner of the corporate brand and then is to be paid a royalty for it. I'll give you another illustration there. You will duck comment again, but the Jindal, JSW group witnessed that a couple of years ago, and it became fairly controversial. And in this case, you have said that it will require minority of majority, correct?
Yeah. So it is ultimately all about conflicts of interest.
Okay. So I think
and not using voting in your own favor, basically.
Yeah. Have I covered some of the key?
I think so. I think we discussed. Chairman and
we discussed chairman and CEO, 50% woman director, 50% attendance, a tighter definition.
I think there's also a sort of a point which is important but sort of buried in a little bit of the details, is about the spirit of independence.
Okay.
Now it's not about just the form of independence, namely ticking all these boxes and not having relationships which would compromise your independence, but also about the mental state. So we had a big debate on, can we really legislate for character? Can we really legislate for what goes on in people's minds? But and finally, I think the formulation that came out was to put the burden back on the conscience of the board and the independent director, that there is nothing else that a social friendship, for instance, or a relationship which is, doesn't technically kind of meet this, but we know it's not independent. There have been cases where people have been neighbors for 30 years who would not fail the independence test, but by no stretch of imagination would be independent.
So how have you prescribed against that?
So the independent director has to say that he's not aware of any circumstance which would compromise his independence, and the board has to accept that view. Board and including the independent directors. So this sort of puts it was very hard to legislate on this, but I think it at least puts the spotlight on this and forces people to think about this question a bit more deeply. I mean, I have faced situations where people have said, we've grown up together and, how can I be independent? Don't count. I would never do anything against this, but they would meet all the tests. So we sort of focusing a bit there as well. And then there is interlocking directorships that has been dealt with as well, where people on each other's boards, technically independent, but we all know why they're there.
Okay. So my very final, quick, very brief question is this. You and I have often talked about how in India we tend to get very prescriptive of many things because we are constantly trying to counter legislate against scams or controversies and situations like that. In your recommendations, you all have made prescriptions or recommendations on updation of knowledge for independent directors or for directors, how non-executive directors should meet with managements at least once a year, matrix reporting structures, etc., etc., etc. Do you think your committee also has somewhere given in to the temptation of being prescriptive?
So one of the other committee members actually used a very nice phrase, which he said that this committee had both a microscope as well as a telescope at the same time. So we had to do the microscope because I think as people, as you say, in the real world, we know how people sometimes find loopholes around the spirit and escape from the applicability. And we needed to have a telescope for, we looked ahead and see why would we want to be remembered, why would this committee want to be remembered, and how would it want to be remembered. This is not the last committee on corporate governance. I'm sure a few years from now there will be another one in some form or the other, because you need to keep this continuous conversation. But at least did it move the needle and change the status quo at this point of time or not? So if it is implemented as recommended, I think it will move the needle.
And do you really think that SEBI will implement 50% of the board being independent?
SEBI has been amazingly supportive on this. Firstly, the very fact that
you think corporate India will allow for that capture of control from the hands of the promoter, the controlling shareholder, into the hands of the independent directors?
So we will know soon in a few months from now.
I think your smile gives away more than I can say.
No, I think this is going to be a big national conversation, and which was the idea. I think this will spark, like this interview does, a lot of conversations in the coming weeks.
Mr. Shroff, I appreciate you finding the time to talk to us today on Bloomberg Queen. With that, those were some of the key highlights of the report. As he says, I'm sure we'll debate this a lot more in the days to come.
SEBI has asked for comments from all stakeholders, and it'll be some time before we see that needle move, well, if at all. Also, the government has opposed several proposals of the committee on grounds that they fall outside SEBI's jurisdiction, and that some have already been proposed as amendments to the Companies Act. For more on that story, visit the Law and Policy page on BloombergQuint.com. That's all on this week's show. Thanks for joining us in the Fine Print today. We'll see you next week.